Time for a special edition of Digging the Details with Jim and Dean. Jim is me, author and Disney historian Jim Fanning. Dean is Disney historian and enthusiast extraordinaire Dean Brinkerhoff. Today's episode is a special edition because unfortunately we had technical difficulties with the opening of our YouTube show. So I'm here to introduce it with a bit of audio. Just pretend this opening is a podcast. It's also a special episode because we are here to dig some details of Disney's Bedknobs and Broomsticks. This magical musical fantasy premiered in London on October 7th, 1971. So it celebrated its 50th anniversary last year. But Dean and I are continuing the celebration because, as this show drops on Tuesday, March 22nd, the 94th Annual Academy Award ceremony is this Sunday. And the 44th Oscars, held on April 10th, 1972, are a big part of the Bedknobs and Broomsticks story. In fact, the film was given a special release pattern in part to tie into the Oscars 50 years ago. So put on your tux or your designer gown, grab your half of the Spells of Astaroth, and join us as we dig some Bedknobs at the Oscars details with a flair. Now, first of all, it probably should be said that Bedknobs and Broomsticks premiered at Radio City Music Hall on November 11th because their holiday season included Thanksgiving, and that's become more common, but I think in those days it wasn't all that common. But they wanted to have their Christmas spectacular up and running for all the tourists that came to New York City for Thanksgiving, etc. But on December 13th, Bedknobs and Broomsticks opened in theaters across the nation, but they were these prestigious first-run theaters. And those included such markets as Anaheim, a city that we know well for a particular reason, Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, Cleveland, Dallas, Indianapolis, Kansas City, Los Angeles, Phoenix. So we've got your state covered and my state covered. Rochester in New York, Sacramento, Salt Lake City, Washington, D.C. Those were just some of the hand-picked markets that Bedknobs ran in for the holiday season. Then the idea was for the next major season for movies, which would be Easter, 1972, this very special movie would then play in the smaller neighborhood markets with the hopes that it would be capitalizing on Oscar nominations and then Oscar wins. And that's exactly what happened. In spring of 1972, Bedknobs and Broomsticks was nominated for 5 Academy Awards. So when it opened for Easter in the smaller and more multiple markets, the ads could proclaim nominated for 5 Academy Awards. And that, of course, got a lot of buzz and a lot more attention. Plus, all markets across the nation had heard about the great reviews that it got and that people were seeing it and loving it. So they were really primed to see it for the Easter season. So sure enough, the Oscar ceremonies were held on April 10th, 1972, and Bedknobs did win an Academy Award from its 5 nominations. So Dean, I'll turn it over to you to tell us about the Oscar that Bedknobs did win.
Of the 5 awards that Bedknobs and Broomsticks was nominated for, it did win 1 for Best Special Visual Effects. And that award was presented to Alan Malley, Eustace Lycett, and Danny Lee. They accepted the award very graciously with some brief thank yous and were quickly off the stage, as it was in those days. But you could tell they were very excited and thrilled that their work had been recognized in this way. Bedknobs and Broomsticks was up against When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth for this nomination, but as it turned out, Bedknobs and Broomsticks was the winner.
And it's really thrilling to me because, of course, Disney's known for its special effects, won the same Oscar among many others for Mary Poppins. So this was following in that tradition, which was quite a thrill.
I agree. I think that this film definitely deserved what it won. I really am always impressed with the visual effects in this film. When you look at everything that goes on, it's actually quite mind blowing to see the inanimate objects dancing around and their big substitutionary locomotion scene where it all comes to life in the room. It's quite remarkable when you stop and think about it. It's easy to watch a movie and not really think about how they brought this to life, but when you really get down to it, looking at what they did, it's truly spectacular, and it really blows me away every time I watch it.
The whole movie is building toward the suits of armor being enchanted and coming forth to battle the Nazis. That is quite an extended sequence, and that's one of the reasons for the great expense of the film, because that was quite expensive. I know that Robert Stevenson, the director, made a special note of that in one of his documents that we still have, he wrote some of his thoughts. And he said something like, the substitutionary locomotion sequence is going to be very expensive, but there's no way around it. We are committed to it. And one thing that Disney always did as a trick is in any extended sequence, like say in the basketball game in The Absent-Minded Professor, they will do things in a different way each time a trick is shown. So just when you're starting to figure it out, they're doing something else. And they're like, your like mind is, well, I don't know how they did that part. So,
Exactly.
It's really fun to see the different ways in which the armor is portrayed in that very extended sequence that really is the climax of the film.
For example, we've got the suits of armor walking, and then they're starting to battle a little bit, and then the Nazis will shoot the suits of armor, and they'll lift their heads off and start shaking the bullets out, or their leg will come off and they'll start shaking off. They just do all kinds of crazy stuff that really makes you on the edge of your seat trying to figure out how they did it. And, and hopefully that's not what you're doing only, but when you're looking at it objectively as a filmmaker or even just a film fan, how they did it, it's quite interesting and fascinating to think about.
Especially for something like that, you can say, well, obviously they have somebody inside that. They're just making it look like there's no one inside the suit of armor. And that's like at its most basic. But just as you're thinking that, they do something else where there's like, okay, there can't be somebody inside that. Or
where's their leg?
Yeah. So they do wire work. They use the sodium vapor process, which was sort of the Disney version of blue screen or green screen, except it was in their case yellow screen, because Disney had to have their own version, their own superior version that they created themselves, and just all kinds of approaches.
All that being said, I think that this Academy Award was definitely well-deserved and well-earned.
Dean, you and I had both mentioned nominations. So aside from its win, the other nominations were Best Art Direction, Best Costume Design, and 2 for the wonderful music, Best Song, The Age of Not Believing, and Best Musical Score. That brings us to something that's come up quite a bit before in the videos that I've done so far for Tulgey Wood TV, which is about the music and the songs of Bedknobs and Broomsticks. Now, some people know that I wrote that extensive article for Persistence of Vision, which was about the making of Bedknobs and Broomsticks. And aside from the documents and other files at the archives, which Dave Smith and Robert Tiemann shared with me as I was writing the article, the core of the article is a very extensive interview I was lucky enough to have with the Sherman Brothers, Richard and Robert. And we talked about the overall experience of creating the film, how it came to be, and also went through every song. That was like a dream come true for me, to sit with them for 3 or 4 hours and talk about nothing but Bedknobs and Broomsticks.
Sure would be for me. Holy moly.
So certainly one of the great aspects of the film's music is that the music was supervised, arranged, and conducted by the great Irwin Costell. And they had worked in their long and illustrious career, the Shermans had worked with Irwin a few times. The first time on Mary Poppins, so need we say more. But it was actually the Sherman Brothers who suggested to Walt Disney that Irwin Costell should be sought out and signed to do that for Mary Poppins. So naturally, when they were doing another big, big musical, they turned again to the great Irwin Costell, and he did a magnificent job on this one and this film as well. This film has a very extensive overture, and I think that in itself is a masterpiece. Anyone that wants to listen to something truly magnificent need look no further than that overture.
I'll second that. It's one of my favorites to listen to of any film. Any film. I think that's my favorite overture.
Yes, I agree with you. And that's one reason that the Shermans shared the nomination with Irwin Costell, because he was so important to the scoring that he was included in the nomination. So the three of them were responsible for the scoring. And Irwin Costell himself composed some bits of music, primarily for the Portobello Road sequence, which is a very, very lavish, lengthy musical interlude, one might almost say, in the film. But his arrangements for the Sherman songs are just absolutely spectacular. It's not only when the songs are performed, but how they're used in the underscore. The Age of Not Believing becomes the theme of whenever the Bedknob is used. And it's the song is performed very simply and beautifully by Angela Lansbury, but then the melody of the song is beautifully arranged and powerfully arranged in a more driving way for whenever the traveling spell is used. And one of the songs that was unfortunately cut, A Step in the Right Direction, that is heard as the underscore for when Miss Price is flying her broomstick. So it's in the film, but not performed. But it's certainly great and is heard in the overture as well. One of the very interesting aspects of Bedknobs that a lot of people are not aware of, because it was released in 1971, is that Walt Disney himself was quite involved in the development of the film, because it was developed in the 60s. He was obviously very involved in that, and Richard Sherman in particular is always very adamant about saying that when Walt Disney was involved, he was involved. So of the Bedknobs songs that were written in that era, and that was most of them, he would always say Walt heard every lyric, every note, and approved. So much of what we see, certainly with the songs, but also the story in the film, has Walt Disney's fingerprints all over it and his approval. It's interesting that the Academy Award nominated song from all the songs that are in the film is one that they did write when they returned to the Disney Studios in 1969 to make this film finally happen in front of the cameras, The Age of Not Believing. And they knew they needed another song, another signature song for its star. So The Age of Not Believing is sort of the keynote song for the whole film, that there has to be a faith in yourself and in what you're doing, despite about perhaps your own insecurities. And the Shermans would talk about how that's kind of how they felt returning to the Disney Studios and doing this major project that Walt had worked on, except now it was without Walt. So they thought about it, well, we have to believe in ourselves now. So they thought about that, and the fact that Charlie is becoming very cynical as he's sort of becoming a teenager, and little Paul and Carrie have no trouble believing in this magic that apparently Miss Price can do. But Charlie's quite the skeptic. So she's just like, suit yourself, but you're going to have to, you're going to have to believe in yourself, and you're going to have to face the fact that you're going through this age of not believing, but you'll come through it, and then you'll believe. So it's beautiful.
Right.
It's beautifully done. The payoff is when the traveling spell actually does work, and then, as we said earlier, the musical motif of the Age of Not Believing is heard triumphantly as they travel to London via the magical spell. So I just love Angela Lansbury's performance, and nobody could do it like that. Nobody could achieve what she achieved with such simplicity, I think. So it's done very well.
And I like how you said, Jim, that it's a keynote song for the film. It really carries through the entirety of it. And I have always felt an emotional connection to that song. I think everyone who watches it really comes away with something special from that, especially that sequence, because we've all hit that age of not believing where it's really hard to sometimes know what to believe anymore or how to get through something. And though Charlie is experiencing this on a very small level, he's not sure if he believes that the magic will work. We've all experienced something in our lives that's hard to believe or hard to understand. And certainly the Shermans, like you were saying, were having those struggles of, man, can we really do this? Was it us in the past, or was it Walt? Can we do this anymore? And I think it's very inspiring and a great message to share, that believing in yourself really helps you to find that power and helps to find your path and your talents and how you can move forward.
I think that's very well said. I think it's also important to note that it is a character song as well, because early in the film, when Miss Price is faced with the challenge of taking in these three strangers from London, which she most certainly does not want to do, she says she doesn't get on with children, which maybe implies that she doesn't know children. She has no experience with children, and maybe would get on with them better if she understood them. But this shows that she does understand them, that she has a wisdom. She has her own way of approaching it. She's just kind of like, suit yourself. We're going to London. Right. You can stay here if you want to. We're going. Well, maybe, it's just very particular to that character. I don't know that anyone else, the other households that were taking children in that village would have approached something like that in the same way. But
she almost tells on herself. She almost is like completely contradicting the fact that she does know how a child will feel and how to overcome that.
Yes.
And so in that way, she is the ideal guardian or caregiver.
Yeah, she is. And it's part of the eccentricity and the uniqueness of the character, which is the whole point of the story, that she has this wisdom that she hasn't even tapped into. She's very practical in her own eccentric way. But it's also interesting, her father comes up several different times in the movie, and she says that it's her father that called it the Age of Not Believing. So she's drawing on the wisdom she received from her own parent to become a surrogate parent to these children. But I just love that that Charlie's being so skeptical, and he's like, I don't fancy making a fool of myself. I'm going to stay right here. And she's like, well, okay, we're going.
Be yourself.
And he only ends up actually going with them because he becomes scared of the cat and jumps on the bed at the last minute to get away from the cat, which is such creative, beautiful storytelling.
Heaven forbid he turns into a rabbit again.
Exactly. Speaking of the Age of Not Believing, the post-Walt era was an age of not believing for Disney itself, because the Disney studios were a little unsure about how to proceed without him, even when they were doing projects that he had begun. And there was a lack of confidence in their own productions at the time, some productions more than others. And this is the one that was second guessed. Songs were cut, for example, and other dramatic portions of the film to make it shorter. For the 25th anniversary in 1996, Disney, under the guidance of Scott McQueen, who was in charge of restoration, decided that they would restore Bedknobs. And it's interesting because all he knew was that on the original cast soundtrack album was the song A Step in the Right Direction. So he thought he would try to find that, put it back in the film. But in so doing, he discovered all this other material that had been cut. Ironically, they never did find A Step in the Right Direction. But they had the soundtrack, obviously. They put it together with stills and were able to recreate it that way, but did not put it back in the movie. For me, it was very interesting because I was already writing the article about the making of the film by coincidence. I had no idea that Scott McQueen had undertaken this project. I knew I wanted to discover what was the story behind these songs that existed on the album but were not in the film, and tell the other stories, whatever they were, of the making of the movie. At some point, as I was in the archives, Dave Smith said to me, "You need to talk to Scott McQueen. He's doing a whole restoration of the film, including restoring a lot of this material that you're writing about." So that was a great thing that Dave did for me. He put me in touch with Scott McQueen. I was able to interview Scott. Part of the article is the very extensive story of exactly how they discovered all this material and put it back in. And so that was very exciting and a complete coincidence. None of this was planned, but I was able to include that. And I was also able, again, thanks to Scott, to go to the Academy re-premiere of Bedknobs and Broomsticks. And everybody that was still around was there. Peter Ellenshaw, Ward Kimball, the Shermans, Roddy McDowell, Angela Lansbury. They were all there for this screening.
Wow, what an exciting opportunity. I'm jealous.
It was very exciting. And so they screened the restoration, and there was a Q&A afterwards. It was very, very wonderful that Scott McQueen hosted. So then the special edition was shown on the Disney Channel. It was released on Laserdisc, but then was also released on DVD. If anyone wants to see Bedknobs and Broomsticks, I would encourage them to seek out the DVD. The Blu-ray does not have the restoration special edition together. The elements are there as bonus features on the Blu-ray. But if you want to see how the whole thing was put together, I recommend the DVD. I will say this one caveat. One thing that is a stumbling block for a lot of people in watching the special edition is the recasting of voices. It does not bother me that the voices are off. They were doing the best that they could in putting together this special edition with missing footage that no longer had the sound. So they had to recreate the sound. Well, just use your imagination. It's better to have that material in with some voices that are not exactly correct or not exactly authentic, and still see how it all worked together. Luckily, both Angela Lansbury and Roddy McDowell, who was still with us at the time, they did their own looping for the new footage. Isn't that fantastic? So we do have those two authentic voices anyhow. As I've encouraged audiences, I even introduced the D23 screening of the special edition one year. Overlook that and just see what's there, how lucky we are that it was all put together.
True. Could have been lost forever like some segments have been.
Exactly.
So we're very lucky. Jim, I'm always fascinated hearing all about your interactions with the cast and the crew. I was curious how you feel the Sherman Brothers ultimately did. I'm not sure if they touched on that at all in any interviews you had with them, but do you think that they felt success in what they did with Bedknobs and Broomsticks, or do you feel that they still had a hard time measuring up without Walt?
I think that they did feel that it was quite an achievement, and especially since they had worked with Walt in developing it, they knew what he wanted, And I think
Yeah.
they knew that they had pulled it off. Now, the disappointment for them was the way the film was treated, and elements were cut out. And, they felt that some of the heart of the film was cut out. Certainly, one of the elements that was cut out was the song segment called "Don't Let Me Down," which is actually part of the overall Eglantine number. That was cut for time. They really did almost a Sondheim-esque approach for Miss Price in kind of talking about her motivation. And she's getting very fed up and impatient with Professor Brown's showmanship way of handling things and his kind of con artist, always selling something way of approaching it. She does lose her patience and explain, where she's coming from, as it were, and why she's trying to do everything she's doing only to help England in this wartime crisis. And it's very interesting because she says, if you help me, I will be willing to discuss with you the idea of going on the stage and all this. So there's that whole dimension is lost when her portion of the song was cut out. And it's a lot of times with the song, the most unusual part of it is the part that makes the song. And that's what really makes it in-depth character stuff, that their heart was broken, that was lost.
Instead, Ward Kimball got his soccer game, right?
Yes, and the soccer game is a whole other issue. Certainly everybody loves the soccer game because it's so well done and it is funny. But there's an imbalance to it because what was originally supposed to happen is that Miss Price was going to, I'm sure this was Professor Brown's idea, that you distract him and I'll get the amulet from him. And she was like, oh, okay, I'll sing a song. So she kind of does this musical song called Solid Citizen. It not only showed another dimension to Miss Price, which was just what was needed at that time in the film. She needed to be opening up. She needed to almost become more like Emilius. And he was impressed and the kids were impressed. They were like, oh, we never saw this side of Miss Price before. Who knew she could pull off this music hall number?
All with a flair.
And it's such a crying shame that was never even filmed, because that's exactly what was needed. And that's the way they planned it. That's the way the Shermans planned it. That's the way Bill Walsh and Don DeGrady, the screenwriters. Bill Walsh
I would have loved to see that.
Yeah.
Wow.
And this sounds like hyperbole, but she really is somebody that can do anything. It's a very funny song that the Shermans wrote. You can hear it on the CD. Richard Sherman's demo. That's what was needed because it was a musical, and when they put in the soccer game, it became less of a musical. Then, with the cuts, it became even less of a musical, and this is the kind of thing that the Shermans were disappointed in. And to your question, I think they did see it as this is stepping further away from Walt's vision for this film, which we know. It was just what was happening at the studio at that time. I think Bill Walsh probably fought for a lot that's still in the film, but he could only do so much because it was all being decided by committee then. And it was the committee that was making these decisions. And Richard and Robert told me, when they were discussing with Bill Walsh, he said, that's showbiz, boys.
Yeah.
That's the bottom line.
The way it goes sometimes.
So it brings us right back to the special edition, the restored version from 1996. So much of what was lost was put back in.
Well, thank you for that, Jim. I really appreciate hearing your insight on that. And I really agree with you. I think that a lot of it was out of their hands, but I think the Shermans really do have a lot to be proud of, and that they certainly did succeed in what they were setting out to do with the film that Walt had started.
I agree with you. And the Academy agreed with us in so
Yeah.
honoring this film. Bedknobs and Broomsticks had to hold its banner high. And I think that in itself is something that the creators could be very proud of. And I'm sure that Walt Disney would have been very proud as well.
Well, Jim, I know certainly Bedknobs and Broomsticks is a favorite of mine, and easily my favorite out of the 1970s for a Disney film. And I'm sure you can agree.
Yeah, you're right. I definitely do.
I don't think any of the others come close.
I have to agree. I mean, certainly it's one of my favorite Disney films, period. But if we look at the post-Walt era, specifically the 1970s, when things really were changing, to me, it's definitely the best. It's an eccentric film. It is a different and unique type film. But to me, that's part of its strength. It just has many rewards than anybody that seeks it out. And again, I'd like to recommend the special edition, especially for people to see a more fulfilled version of what Bill Walsh, Don DeGrady, the Shermans, Robert Stevenson, and Walt Disney, yes, Walt Disney himself, envisioned.
And I can agree there. I personally have never seen the shorter version, but I can't imagine those segments being missing from the film.
Okay, now wait a minute. This surprising admission came up out of nowhere. I don't think I realized you'd never seen the release version, the 117-minute version.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating. I think you'll have to see it someday just to.
I do own it, but
yeah, I think you'll have to watch it someday to compare it. Are you very aware when you watch the special edition of what's been added and what was not? I mean, sometimes you can tell because of the voices, like we've already mentioned.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've watched the documentary where it specifically points out where they added.
Okay.
And I can recognize some of the voice changes, but for the most part, everything is as it's always been to me. So
I love that. Well, I certainly have talked to people that say after they saw the special edition, they could never watch the shorter version again. And I myself wouldn't go that far, but I agree in principle on that. Because the superior version is the special edition, because that reflects more what the filmmakers had in mind before the studio decided they had to make these cuts. And the creators were not on board with that, but they had no choice.
Yep, agreed.
Well, this is such a rich subject, as almost all Disney subjects are, that we can definitely revisit Bedknobs again and dig up some more details. But until then, he's Dean.
And he's Jim.
And we'll see you next time for another edition of Digging the Details.